My name is Silas Vance, and I was born in 1840 in the rugged hills of Virginia, in a world that no longer exists except in the fading ink of old ledgers and the heavy silence of the earth. I am an old man now, well into my 80s, and I have lived to see the horse give way to the engine and the candle flame succumb to the electric wire. But as the world outside speeds toward a future I barely recognize, my mind remains tethered to a single summer in my youth, a time of such profound sweetness and devastating sorrow that it has colored every day I have lived since. They say that time heals all wounds, but they are wrong. Time only teaches you how to carry the weight of what you have lost. To understand why I am sitting here today, speaking into the void of my own memories, you must understand the world of my father. He was a man of iron and scripture, a stern farmer who believed that any moment not spent in prayer or labor was a doorway for the devil. Our farm was a place of order and silence, where the only music was the rhythmic thud of the axe and the low lowing of the cattle. I was the eldest of 4, and from the moment I could hold a bucket, my life was measured in chores. We woke before the sun. The air in our small cabin, so cold it turned our breath into ghosts, and we worked until the shadows stretched long across the valley. There was no room for softness in my father's house, and certainly no room for the kind of feelings that would eventually lead to my undoing. My mother was a quiet shadow of a woman, her spirit worn thin by years of isolation and the relentless demands of the land. She spoke mostly in whispers, her eyes always darting toward my father as if seeking permission to exist. I remember the calluses on her hands and the way she would sometimes pause by the window, looking out toward the horizon with a longing so deep it made my own chest ache. I didn't know then that I had inherited that same restless heart, that same hunger for something more than the dirt beneath my fingernails and the judgment in my father's voice. The year I turned 18, the world seemed to expand. The tensions between the North and the South were beginning to simmer, though in our isolated corner of the hills, the coming war felt like a distant storm. My father, however, saw the shifting tides as a sign of moral decay. He became even more rigid, more watchful. He spoke often of the corruptions of the town and the vanities of the flesh. I was expected to marry a girl from a neighboring farm, a sensible, hard-working woman who would bring more land into our family and produce more sons to work it. That was the path laid out for me, a straight, narrow road leading toward a respectable, empty life. But then the world brought me Elias. He arrived in the valley during the harvest of 1858, a traveling laborer looking for work. He was unlike any man I had ever met. He didn't carry the heavy, stoop gait of the local farmers. He moved with a grace that felt almost defiant, and when he spoke, his voice didn't sound like a command or a prayer. It sounded like music. My father hired him because he was strong and cheap, never suspecting that by bringing Elias onto our land, he was inviting the very corruption he so feared into the heart of his home. I remember the first time I really looked at him. We were in the high meadow, cutting the tall grass under a sun that felt like a physical weight on our shoulders. I paused to wipe the sweat from my brow, and I saw him standing a few yards away, his shirt discarded, his skin bronzing in the light. He looked over at me and smiled, not a polite nod, a real, vibrant smile that reached his eyes. In that moment, something inside me, something I hadn't even known was there, reached back. It was a terrifying sensation, a sudden, violent awakening. For weeks, We worked side by side in a silence that was entirely different from the silence of my father's house. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions and a growing electric awareness. We would catch each other's eyes across the dinner table, or our hands would brush as we passed a tool, and the world would seem to tilt on its axis. I started to find excuses to be where he was. I would linger in the barn after the evening milking, or offer to help him with the repairs on the fences. Every moment spent in his company felt like I was stealing something precious, something I knew I could never keep. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling. In 1858, in the rural hills of Virginia, there were no words for two men who looked at each other with the hunger that eclipsed the sun. There was only the law, the church, and the heavy hand of tradition. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was a sin that would lead to damnation. And yet, when Elias finally spoke to me, really spoke to me, late one night behind the stables, none of that mattered. The world narrowed down to just the two of us, standing in the cold moonlight, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly alive. The summer of 1858 remains in my mind as a series of stolen glances and the constant, thrumming fear of being caught. We lived in a world where the walls had ears and the trees had eyes, or so it felt to a young man carrying a secret that could forfeit his soul and his life. Elias was 22, for years my senior, and he possessed a worldliness that both fascinated and terrified me. He had traveled from the docks of Baltimore down through the valley, working for his bread and sleeping under the stars. He told me stories of the great ships that sailed across the Atlantic and of cities where thousands of people lived packed together, a concept I could hardly fathom in the isolation of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Our relationship developed in the quiet margins of the day. While my father believed we were merely finishing the repair of a stone wall or tending to the horses in the back pasture, we were discovering a language of touch and unspoken understanding. I remember one evening, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle, when we sat by the creek at the edge of our property. The water rushed over the smooth stones, a constant, soothing white noise that masked our whispers. Elias reached out and took my hand, his palm rough with the same calluses as mine, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. I didn't look back toward the farmhouse. I simply let myself exist in that moment, tethered to him by nothing more than the heat of his skin against mine. He spoke to me of a life I had never imagined. He didn't believe in the harsh, vengeful God my father preached about every Sunday. Elias spoke of a creator who made the mountains and the rivers for joy, not just for judgment. To hear such things was like drinking water after a lifetime of thirst. He saw me not just as a laborer or a son, but as a person with thoughts and desires of my own. He asked me what I wanted, a question no one had ever bothered to put to me before. I told him I wanted to see the ocean. I told him I wanted to read books that weren't the Bible. I told him, in the safety of the dark, that I wanted to be with him. But the sweetness was always tempered by the reality of our surroundings. My father's suspicion was a living thing, a cold draft that followed me through the house. He noticed a change in me, the way I became distracted, the way I no longer looked him in the eye during our evening prayers. He began to assign me tasks that kept me away from Elias, sending me to the far end of the county to trade livestock, or keeping me in the cellar for days on end to organize the winter stores. The distance was a physical ache, a hollow space in my chest that only filled when I saw Elias's silhouette moving across the yard. One night, in the loft of the barn where the air smelled of dry hay and old wood, Elias whispered a plan. He wanted us to leave. He spoke of heading west, toward the territories where the law was thin and a man could reinvent himself. He said we could find work together, perhaps start a small ranch of our own. It was a beautiful, impossible dream. To leave meant turning my back on my family, my heritage, and every scrap of security I had ever known. It meant becoming a ghost in my own home. But as I looked at him, the moonlight catching the silver in his eyes, I realized that I was already a ghost. I was living a life that wasn't mine, playing a role in a play I hadn't written. We began to prepare in secret. I started setting aside a few coins here and there, hiding them beneath the loose floorboard in my room. Elias gathered what little supplies he could carry without drawing notice. We decided we would leave on the night of the first frost, when the harvest was done and the chaos of the season would provide a brief window of distraction. Every day that passed felt like a tightrope walk. I was terrified that my father would see the guilt written on my face, or that a neighbor would see us standing just a little too close in the shadows. There was a girl, Sarah Miller, the daughter of a man my father respected. She started coming around more often, brought by her father under the guise of neighborly visits. My father began to drop heavy hints about our future, about how the Miller land bordered ours, and how a union would be beneficial for both families. Sarah was a kind girl, with soft eyes and a gentle voice, and in another life, I might have been happy with her. But every time she smiled at me, I felt like a fraud. I was a man leading a double life, a man whose heart was already promised to a laborer who slept in the barn. The pressure built until it felt like the very air was pressurized. The secret was a weight that pulled at my shoulders, making every step heavy. I loved Elias with a ferocity that frightened me, a love that felt as natural as the turning of the seasons and as dangerous as a mountain fire. We were two souls trying to find a way to breathe in a world that wanted to suffocate us. We didn't know then that the storm was already gathering, and that the tragedy we were trying to outrun was already waiting for us, just beyond the horizon. We thought we had time. We thought we had a chance. But in the autumn of 1858, the world was not a place for men like us, and the price of our forbidden love was about to be called due. The autumn of 1858 arrived with a sharpness that felt like a warning. The vibrant greens of the Virginia hills turned into a bruised palette of rust and dying gold, and the morning air began to carry the scent of wood smoke and frost. On the farm, this was the season of frantic preparation. Every hour of daylight was a commodity, used to harvest the last of the corn, slaughter the hogs, and ensure the cellar was packed tight against the coming winter. But for Elias and me, every setting sun brought us closer to the date we had whispered about in the dark, the 3rd of November. We had chosen that date because my father and the other men from the neighboring farms would be traveling to the county seat for a livestock auction and a town meeting. They would be gone for 2 days, leaving the farm under my supervision. It was the only window we would ever have. We planned to take 2 of the older horses, ones my father wouldn't miss immediately, and ride north toward the rail lines. From there, we would disappear into the vast, churning belly of the country, moving west until the name Silas Vance meant nothing to anyone we passed. As the day approached, the weight of the deception became nearly unbearable. I found myself looking at my mother, watching her quiet, rhythmic movements in the kitchen, and feeling a sudden, sharp pang of grief. I was leaving her alone with my father's iron will. I wanted to tell her, to take her hands and explain that I wasn't just a disobedient son, that I was a man trying to save his own life. But I remained silent. To speak was to risk everything, and in our world, the price of the truth was often blood. Elias, too, was changing. The easy, confident smile I had fallen in love with was replaced by a grim, focused intensity. He worked harder than any 3 men, as if by exhausting his body, he could quiet the nerves that kept him awake at night. We barely spoke during the day, keeping our distance to avoid even the slightest hint of impropriety. But sometimes, when we passed each other in the yard, our eyes would meet for a fraction of a second, and in that look, there was a shared world of terror and hope. The Sunday before our planned departure, the air in the small wooden church felt heavy, suffocating. The preacher, a man who saw the hand of the devil in every shadow, spoke at length about the abominations that walk among us. He quoted scriptures that felt like stones being cast directly at my chest. I sat in the pew, my shoulder touching my father's, and felt like a wolf in a sheep's pen. I looked at the back of Elias's head, 3 rows in front of me, and wondered if he felt the same suffocating pressure of the walls closing in. That afternoon, a neighbor, Mr. Henderson, stopped by our farm. He was a man who took great pride in knowing everyone's business, a gossip who hid his malice behind a veneer of Christian concern. He and my father stood by the fence for a long time, their voices low and urgent. I was sharpening a scythe by the barn, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw Henderson point toward the barn loft, where Elias slept. I saw my father's posture stiffen, his jaw setting in that way that always preceded a storm. When Henderson left, my father didn't speak to me. He didn't yell. He simply walked into the house and closed the door with a finality that made the hair on my arms stand up. I sought out Elias immediately, finding him near the creek. "He knows," I whispered, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "Something is wrong. Henderson saw us, or someone talked." Elias didn't panic. He just looked at the water, his face pale. "Then we don't wait for the 3rd, he said. "We go tonight, as soon as the house is dark. Meet me at the old oak by the north ridge. Don't bring anything you don't need. Just yourself." The rest of the day was a blur of feigned normalcy. I ate supper with my family, the silence at the table so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. My father kept his eyes fixed on his plate, his prayers longer and more fervent than usual. Every time his gaze flickered toward me, I felt a cold shiver of dread. I realized then that he didn't just suspect. He was waiting. He was watching the trap, waiting for the prey to move. I went to my room at the usual hour, lying fully clothed on top of my quilt. I listened to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of the floorboards, the hoot of an owl in the distance, the heavy, rhythmic snoring of my brothers in the next room. At midnight, I slipped my boots on, tied my small bundle of belongings to my belt, and crawled out the window. The night was bone-chillingly cold, the first true frost of the year turning the grass into silver needles that crunched beneath my feet. I moved like a shadow, keeping to the tree line, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. I reached the old oak, my eyes straining against the darkness. Elias was there, holding the reins of two horses, his face a pale mask in the moonlight. "We have to be fast," he whispered, helping me mount. We turned the horses toward the ridge, toward the narrow mountain pass that would lead us out of the valley. For a few minutes, as the wind whipped against my face and the rhythmic hoofbeats filled the air, I felt a surge of incredible, dangerous freedom. We were doing it. We were escaping the world that had tried to bury us alive. But as we reached the crest of the hill, a flash of light cut through the darkness. A lantern, then another, and then the sound I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. The sharp, metallic click of a rifle being cocked. My father's voice rose out of the shadows, cold and devoid of any mercy. "Stop right there, Silas. And you, boy, get off that horse before I send you to meet your maker ahead of schedule." We weren't escaping. We were riding directly into the heart of the tragedy that would end the only life I had ever wanted to live. The lantern light was blinding, a sharp yellow spear that pierced the velvet blue of the mountain night. My father stepped forward from behind a stand of skeletal birch trees, his heavy wool coat dusted with the same frost that coated the world. Behind him, two of our neighbors, men I had known since I was a child, held rifles across their chests. Their faces were shadowed, but I could feel their collective judgment, a cold, suffocating weight that felt heavier than the mountain itself. I looked at my father's face, and for the first time in my life, I saw something more terrifying than his anger. I saw a total, chilling absence of love. Elias didn't move. He sat tall in the saddle, his hands visible on the reins. I could hear his horse shifting, the animal sensing the sudden, violent tension in the air. "Silas," my father said, his voice a low, guttural rasp, "step away from that creature. Come home now, and we will purge this sickness from you. We will pray until the devil leaves your blood." "I'm not coming back, Father," I said, my voice trembling but certain. "There is no sickness. There is only the life I want to live, and it isn't here." My father's jaw tightened. He didn't look at me again. He looked at Elias. To him, I was a wayward sheep that could be beaten back into the fold. But Elias was the wolf. Elias was the outsider, the laborer who had brought sin into his sanctuary. "You," my father spat, the word dripping with loathing, "you have corrupted my blood. You have spat upon the hospitality of this house and the laws of God. You will leave this valley tonight, one way or another." "We are leaving together," Elias said, his voice remarkably calm. He reached out a hand toward me, a gesture of solidarity that, in that moment, was the bravest thing I had ever seen. But as his fingers brushed mine, the world exploded. One of the neighbors, perhaps startled by the movement or perhaps simply eager to end the confrontation, raised his rifle. I saw the flash of the muzzle before I heard the report. The sound was deafening, a crack like the breaking of the world. Elias didn't scream. He simply jerked backward, his body absorbing the impact with a sickening thud. He slumped forward over the horse's neck, his hands losing their grip on the reins. I screamed his name, a sound that felt like it was tearing my throat open, and lunged toward him. I caught him as he began to slide from the saddle, the two of us tumbling into the frozen grass. The silence that followed was worse than the gunshot. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the panicked breathing of the horses and the sound of my own sobbing. I pulled Elias into my lap, my hand searching for the wound, feeling the hot, wet stickiness of his blood soaking through my coat. In the pale moonlight, the red looked black, like ink spilled across a white page. "Elias," I whispered, pressing my face against his. "Elias, please, stay with me. We're going west. Remember? We're going to see the ocean." He looked up at me, his eyes clouded and unfocused. He tried to speak, his lips moving soundlessly, and then a small, crimson bubble formed at the corner of his mouth. He reached up, his hand fumbling for my face, his touch light as a falling leaf. He smiled then, that same defiant, beautiful smile from a high meadow, and then the light simply went out of him. His hand dropped to the frost-covered earth, and I felt the life leave his body in one long, shuddering sigh. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at the men with the guns. I sat there in the dirt, cradling the only person who had ever truly known me, and I felt my own soul begin to wither. My father stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He reached down to grab my shoulder, to pull me away from the abomination, but I turned on him with a ferocity that made him stumble back. "Don't touch me," I snarled, the words fueled by a grief so deep it had turned into a cold, hard diamond of hate. "You killed him. You killed the only thing in this world that was good." "I saved you, Silas," he said, though for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I saved your soul from the fire." I looked down at Elias's still, pale face, and then back at my father. "My soul died with him," I said. "They made me leave him there. They dragged me back to the farm, locking me in the cellar for 3 days while they dealt with the body. I never found out where they buried him. My father never spoke his name again. To the rest of the valley, Elias was just a laborer who had moved on in the night, a transient shadow that had disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. But for me, the world had ended on that ridge. The boy who had dreamed of the ocean was gone, replaced by a man who was nothing more than a hollow shell, carrying a ghost in his heart through a life that had become a long, gray winter. The Civil War came 3 years later, a great devourer that swallowed the world I had known. When the drums began to beat and the men of the valley marched off to defend a way of life that had already taken everything from me, I went with them, not out of loyalty to a cause or a flag, but because I was looking for a bullet. I wanted the same peace that Elias had found on that ridge. I spent 4 years in the smoke and the mud, witnessing horrors that would make a man scream in his sleep, but the Reaper always passed me by. I survived the wilderness, I survived Gettysburg, and I survived the surrender, returning to a Virginia that was as broken and hollow as I was. My father was dead by then, his heart having given out while working the very soil he prized above his own son's happiness. My mother followed him shortly after, her light simply flickering out one quiet winter evening. I inherited the farm, the land that had been the stage for my greatest joy and my deepest agony. I sold it within a month. I couldn't stand the way the wind sounded in the high meadow, or the way the shadows fell across the barn loft. I took what little money I had and I finally went west, just as Elias and I had planned. I lived many lives after that. I worked the rails in Kansas, I herded cattle in Texas, and eventually I settled in a small coastal town in California, where the air smells of salt and the horizon never ends. I married a woman named Martha, a widow with a kind heart who understood that some parts of a man are permanently locked away. We raised 3 children, and I was a good father to them. I never raised my voice. I never spoke of iron-fisted gods, and I never forced them into lives they didn't choose. I gave them the freedom that had been stolen from me. But in the quiet moments when the house is still and the fog rolls in off the Pacific, I am 18 years old again. I am back in the hills of Virginia, feeling the warmth of a hand against mine by the creek. People look at me now, a wrinkled old man of 86, and they see a survivor of a bygone era. They see a relic of history. They don't see the boy who is still waiting under an old oak tree on a frost-covered ridge. They don't know that my real life ended in 1858, and everything since has been a long, weary epilogue. I never found another love like that. I don't believe the world allows for it twice. What Elias and I had was a flash of lightning in a very dark room, brief, terrifying, and brilliant enough to blind you for the rest of your days. I have carried his memory like a hidden locket, tucked away where the world cannot touch it or judge it. I have lived to see the 20th century, to see machines fly and voices travel through the air. But no invention has ever been able to bridge the gap between the man I am and the man I was meant to be. As I sit here today, I find I am no longer angry. The hate for my father has softened into a dull, heavy ache of pity. He lived his life in a cage of his own making, a prisoner to a tradition that demanded he sacrifice his own flesh and blood. I am the one who got away, even if the price of my escape was my heart. I look at the ocean now, the great blue expanse we dreamed of, and I imagine he is out there somewhere in the spray and the light. My time is short now. I can feel the shadows lengthening, and the cold of that November night is finally beginning to settle in my bones. I am not afraid. I have lived a long life, a full life, but I am ready to go back to the ridge. I am ready to see if he is still waiting there with the horses, ready to ride into a sunset that never fades. My name is Silas Vance. I was born in 1840, and I have loved one man with a devotion that the world couldn't understand. And if that is my legacy, then I will carry it proudly into the dark.